So, Jordie, mate, despite the differences in the two major Australian political parties entering this federal election that we have coming up, there seems to be one consistent theme that both parties are unified on, and that is an increase in military spending, mate. Can you tell me a bit more about that? What's going on?
Yes, definitely. So on the last conversation we had, I made a bit of a prediction. This was just after the Chinese naval vessels had been off the coast of Australia, and obviously all the hysteria that accompanied that. I made a little bit of a prediction that there was going to be a shift towards more defence spending, and that the upcoming federal election potentially might be framed as one on national security.
Yeah.
So after that episode and my prediction, behold, guess what happened?
An announced increase in spending, perhaps.
Yeah, so the coalition have come out now and they have pledged to spend an additional $2 billion to acquire an extra 28 F-35 fighter jets.
28 F-35s?
Correct.
That's a lot.
That would bring our total number up to 100.
Wow.
So I don't know we actually had that many F-35 jets.
Neither did I.
But we do. So what should be pointed out, first of all, the F-35 fighter jet, produced by Lockheed Martin, has been one of the most expensive productions of any military equipment.
Oh, so wasn't it about estimated $1 trillion just in the development?
Correct.
Yeah.
They have been plagued with issues from software to hardware to operability capabilities to issues with their stealth systems and whatnot.
I've heard they can't land or take off from a runway with gravel on it, for example.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's right. So, so straight afterwards, the coalition announced that we were going to purchase another 28 of them. What should be pointed out is that they did not specify where the money was going to come from, but it was them trying to show the public that they were committed to more military spending.
Yes.
And what was really fascinating, what was coinciding at the exact same time, was that Elbridge Colby, who's Trump's choice to head the policy curation in the US Department of Defense, came out and commented on Australia's defense spending. So here's a quote from him. He said, "The main concern the United States should press with Australia, consistent with the President's approach, is higher defence spending." Colby went on to argue that Australia is currently well below the 3% level that NATO Secretary Mark Rutte is calling for, and Canberra faces a far more powerful challenge in China. End quote.
So he's comparing us to NATO, however.
Correct.
We're not in NATO.
That's exactly right. But he's saying that it's consistent with the push from President Trump that American allies should be spending a lot more on defence.
Yes. So we should be giving them a lot more money, essentially.
But yes, to
sum it up.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What I found fascinating, though, was Colby's view on AUKUS. So he's been actually really incredibly sceptical of the AUKUS program.
Really?
Yeah, so he comes from the school of realism, of realpolitik in the United States, and he's went as far to go and call AUKUS as quote-unquote crazy, because he thinks that giving Australia nuclear submarines would weaken the US's naval capacity.
Oh, so he's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. He's saying we can't allow Australia to have nuclear submarines because that would increase Australia's capability.
Well, not increase our capability, but decrease their capability, and that it would weaken their submarine fleet.
But Jordie, aren't they building us new submarines? Isn't that the whole point?
No, that's not the whole point.
Oh, no.
So, but what I also found really fascinating was not just his comments that Australia should spend more on defence, 3% of GDP, or that AUKUS was crazy, but Elbridge Colby, does that ring any bells to you?
The name definitely sounds familiar in kind of deep state US circles.
So he is the grandson of William Colby, who was the director of the CIA from 1973 to 1976.
Of course.
And James, what happened in Australia between 1973 and 1976?
That involves the CIA?
Yes.
Well, Jordie, I'm glad you asked. We had a very popular Prime Minister by the name of Gough Whitlam, who implemented many big reforms in Australia, and was also probably the last Prime Minister that was very critical of our alliance with the United States, even going as far as to say he wanted to remove the United States Pine Gap base from Australian territory and pull Australian troops out of the Vietnam War.
Yes.
His ousting which was orchestrated by the Governor-General, it has been pretty heavily theorised and documented that there was strong CIA involvement, as well as strong involvement from the British Crown also.
Yeah. So, I thought that was very fascinating.
That is very fascinating.
Little footnote there.
It is interesting, sorry, just not to derail the conversation too much, but how in the United States they still have political dynasties.
Yes, they do.
You know, like he's the grandson. So obviously we don't have monarchs anymore, but you still have these dynastic families in the US that kind of dominate policy.
These players and families that exist within the Pentagon and the State Department that are able to keep pursuing this similar kind of policy.
Yeah, but as we all know about the US, it really is a system based on pure meritocracy.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Sorry, continue.
No, that's right. So basically we now have both the major parties in lockstep towards an increase in military spending, both supporting AUKUS. At the moment, we are spending 2% of GDP on military spending. That has been... that is going to increase to 2.4% over the next decade. And obviously these calls for 3% of GDP I thought were fascinating because according to Marcus Hellier, who's a defence economist, a rise to 3% would see Australia's military spending go from $56 billion annually to around $130 billion in the next decade.
Oh, that's a big increase.
It's about double.
Yeah.
Because obviously when you frame it as a percentage of GDP...
Factoring in GDP growth, obviously.
It's kind of murky way of framing the actual spending. It's not just saying we're going to spend $50 billion annually. It's no 3% of GDP, which will work out to, $130 billion annually in the next decade.
But Jordie, from what you've said as well, it doesn't sound like we're going to be developing new military capabilities indigenous in Australia. We're not going to be that money's not going to be going very much towards kind of manufacturing capabilities domestically.
No, of course not.
It's going to be going straight overseas, a large portion of that.
That's right, and that's what AUKUS is all about at the moment. However, though, one of the conversations that's come up about how they would fund this new defence spending, which I thought was interesting, was the issuing of war bonds.
War bonds?
Correct.
Are we in the US in 1940s right now, man?
No. So in World War I and World War II, a lot of nations, including Australia, paid for the war by issuing war bonds, which is basically a share in debt that you can purchase from the government, and then obviously you get paid a interest on top of that in the future. It allows people to invest obviously in our military capability. It's been a big thing in NATO at the moment, in the European Union, to pay for the increase in defence spending for the Ukraine war. So there's now been even discussions here in Australia about issuing war bonds.
That seems a bit insane, to be honest. Like, what if you don't win the war? you know, and probably from an investment point of view, if you don't win the war, what are your war bonds worth? You know.
Well, at this time though, the increase in defence spending, it's going to be hard for them to either take money from the federal budget somewhere else. So obviously there'll be cuts to other areas within inside the budget, an increase in debt, or an increase in taxes.
So, all three options, not great.
Not very feasible at the moment.
Not very feasible,
Not whatsoever. That's exactly right. So, funny enough, Elbridge Colby came out and said that AUKUS was a crazy idea. And there has, in the past few weeks now, seemed to be some rumbles within inside Australia against AUKUS. So, we've now had Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister, go on the project and voice his condemnation and concerns of AUKUS. We've now had constituencies from the Labor Party, from the branches across Australia, coming out now against AUKUS. There seems to be a little bit of an internal kind of uprising against it within inside the party. Not at the elite levels, but definitely at the branch levels.
Of course.
So it seems that the wind now is starting to kind of push into the opposite direction. We're seeing a lot of pushback against it.
Well, because I haven't actually met one person in Australia who thinks AUKUS is a good idea.
No.
When explained the intricacies of the deal, past just the rhetoric, I've met one person that thinks it's a good idea. I do not think it's a very popular concept.
No.
And I think most Australians are suffering a lot in other areas, and they just think we have far bigger fish to fry than commit towards AUKUS, for example.
Well, I did think this was very significant. So last week we had Malcolm Turnbull go on the project, which as far as kind of middle-of-the-road television. It's pretty garbage.
It is.
However, it's significant because when this kind of conversation is happening on the project, you know that it's getting out to middle Australia.
Absolutely.
To your everyday person that doesn't really know much about AUKUS, but seeing Malcolm Turnbull, our former Prime Minister, come out and seriously oppose it. So this is what Turnbull had to say, and I thought this was quite fascinating.
Before you play that, I just want to note as well, for anyone that doesn't know, Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister and he was part of the Liberal Party, who he is actually criticising. He has been criticising the Liberal Party and their candidate in the upcoming election, Peter Dutton. It's interesting to know.
I seem to think that we're never going to see these US submarines that we've been promised. Is that right?
Look, I think it's very unlikely, Waleed, really very unlikely. I mean, look, they're great submarines, there's no doubt about that. But the problem is that the deal that was done was a very, very bad deal for Australia. So we're paying the Americans $3 billion to support their submarine industry, but they do not have an obligation to transfer or sell any submarines to us unless their president at the time, which would be, say, around 2030, 2031, certifies that the transfer of the submarines would not degrade the undersea capability of the US Navy. Now, right now, they are short of submarines. They're producing about half as many as they should be producing. And by 2032, when we're meant to get the first one, they will be more than 20 submarines short of what they need. So it's very, very unlikely that the president of the day is going to say, no, we don't need those subs. We can sell them to the Aussies. So I think, regrettably, the shot of the great AUKUS submarine project is that we will end up with no submarines.
Is this about you being upset because you were the architect of the French deal and you'd rather this gets torn up and we go back to that?
No, I've just explained the situation. I mean, the legislation is very clear. We've taken that risk, and it is a massive risk. And you'd have to say, being objective about it, that it is very unlikely that we will get a Virginia-class submarine. Now, this has got nothing to do with Donald Trump. You could have a president who is the most pro-Australian there ever has been. There could be a whole row of, stuffed kangaroos and koalas on the mantelpiece. But at the end of the day, the legislation, the American legislation, requires him or her to ask, does the US Navy need these subs? And you'd have to say today the answer would unquestionably be yes. And I don't think, and most people who are familiar with this don't think it will change between now and 2032. We're providing a submarine base in Perth for the Americans, and they'll have submarines there, and I suppose we will hope that their submarines will protect us. But we will not have any sovereign submarine capability of our own. It's a fiasco, I'm afraid.
So this is something that I've been saying on the podcast for a long time now. Malcolm Turnbull has just summarised that far more eloquently, in my opinion.
Of course, yeah. No, that's it. Well, he kind of just lays it all out there, doesn't he?
He does. That's exactly
And obviously, as in, like that ruddy-faced reactionary interviewer said to him, are you sure this isn't just about Malcolm Turnbull being the orchestrator of the French submarine deal, which we scuttled, pun intended, to facilitate the American deal? And he did say no. And I think the French submarine deal, in hindsight, would have been a much better option for Australia than the AUKUS deal.
Yeah. So obviously both parties here are just in lockstep with AUKUS. However, the only kind of mainstream political opposition has been coming from the Greens, obviously a minor party, and specifically from Senator David Shoebridge, who at several Senate hearings has grilled members of the Australian military about how AUKUS would not be a sovereign capability, that the money we're sending to the US, if we don't get the submarines, will not be refunded, etc., etc. However, this week, and this I thought was rather interesting, I read the headline twice, was that Shoebridge and the Greens have announced that they would scrap AUKUS and use the money to produce our own sovereign defence capabilities and, quote-unquote,
the Greens,
uncrewed marine and aerial vehicles as well as missile defence systems strictly for the self-defence of Australia, produced and manufactured here in Australia.
Wow.
And I thought, honestly,
wow.
partisanship aside, I thought that was really fascinating. I really did.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Because I think even they... What does that indicate about them? The Greens have always been anti-war, but I think even they're saying, look, there is political necessity to have a stance, have a stance on military policy, but at least theirs is obviously differing.
Yeah, that's right. And they said
amazing.
that they would,
made in Australia. Wow.
And they said that they would scrap purchasing Black Hawk helicopters from the United States and the M1A2 Abrams tanks that we're now going to be getting.
Well, the Black Hawk helicopters, they're like 50 years old, aren't they? Yeah. You think you can get some newer tech. Even, do you know what would make us even safer?
Yeah.
Chinese military tech.
So no, a real emphasis though on producing Australian weapons there for our own self-defence, which you don't get from either of the major two parties. Also, David Shoebridge quoted to have said, having a sovereign capacity which you can control, which can't be turned off at 24 hours notice by the likes of Donald Trump, that's actually important for our security.
So I believe he's referring to the fact that the F-35s can be remotely controlled from Washington. So
he's obviously talking about having our own sovereign capabilities, but also not having US weapons that, in the instance of war with China, Australia would not have control of. The submarines Australia would not have control of. They really would come under control of the United States. And what you just mentioned was really interesting, because what's been happening over the past week in Europe is a whole lot of leaders getting up and saying that we need to produce our own weapons and shift away from the United States because they are no longer a reliable ally. And these concerns have come from Portugal and Canada.
Ah, of course, yeah.
So
Canada, obviously, their economy very tightly intertwined with the United States.
Yeah, but both countries now have said that they will cease acquiring any more F-35 fighter jets.
Yep.
There was a rumour last week that the F-35 fighter jet has a kill switch inside it.
Yes.
So that they can be remotely turned off by the United States.
That's what I have heard.
Which the US obviously denied flat out.
Yeah.
Still thought that was really funny, but they're taking it seriously. So Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, came out and said, I think is it Thales, the big French...
Thales,
sorry.
I think they're Australian, aren't they?
No, they're a French weapons producer.
Yeah.
They're one of the largest that Europe has.
Yeah.
They've come out now and said that they are going to start producing the equivalent of the F-35 fighter jet and the Patriot missile defence system for Europe.
Do you know what? Good on them.
No, but it shows also this really interesting shift now.
Yeah, because they don't want to be as subservient, and they're realising, I guess, the vulnerabilities that are at play there.
Correct. They're finally waking up and saying, hang on a sec, we can't just rely on the United States defence umbrella anymore, especially with Trump in office, but with potentially any future president that wants to pull out of Europe, refocus on the Indo-Pacific. So the Europeans are saying, hang on a sec, we're not going to buy any more weapons from the United States. We're going to produce our own.
Well, I did see as well, for example, the massive German car manufacturing behemoth Volkswagen. They have come out recently and they've also said that, like, look, obviously our sales are down. We're not really profitable anymore because we don't have access to clean gas.
Yep.
However, with massive government subsidies, we can refit lots of our manufacturing capabilities to start producing weapons and armaments.
Yep.
I mean, if I lived in Europe, especially to the east of Germany and Central Europe, I would be very worried because this has never ended well historically, and it's a funny precedent. But I guess we'll have to see how it progresses.
That's right. And look, you can listen to Malcolm Turnbull, or you can listen to us on Left Hook podcast, and
far more knowledgeable than Malcolm Turnbull, obviously.
No, but the fact that we are looking at this, I think, objectively and saying it's a terrible deal, it costs heaps of money, we're selling our sovereignty, etc., etc. However, I think you should listen to what officials inside the Pentagon are saying, because this is straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
So I was reading an article the other day in the Australian Foreign Affairs magazine, and they were discussing about how the Pentagon, how its strategy for Australia is being discussed inside the halls of the Imperial Core, where war is planned and made.
Yeah.
And I think this is what we need to listen to at the end of the day. So what was really fascinating is they were talking about how They are seeing Australia divided up into 3 zones. So you have the north of Australia, which will be the area the United States see as their force projection zone.
Yeah.
That is where, at the moment, we have 2,000 US troops stationed. I have read elsewhere that it's more like 5 to 10,000, and in the next coming years, it'll easily be 10,000.
Yeah.
We have B-52 bombers to be stationed inside Katherine. We have an upgrade to all the airfields across the north of Queensland, the Northern Territory and Western Australia, where more US aircraft will be stationed. You have the centre of Australia, which is the second zone, and this is being described as kind of a middle stationing area where you have Pine Gap, which will link up to the third zone, which is the south of Australia, from Perth to Adelaide to Melbourne, where the major population centres are. And this is what I found interesting. It is referred to as the soft underbelly of Australia inside the holes of the Pentagon. And the reason they call that is because they see it as not just the soft underbelly, but the area where we will be able to produce US weapons for the United States to use from the north of Australia.
Of course.
So obviously the production of the AUKUS frigates, AUKUS submarines, and AUKUS munitions.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty, it's not nice when someone says the place where you live is a soft underbelly. That's a bit worrying, but that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So they've already got it all sorted.
Yeah, that's exactly
They've already
right.
got the next 20 years of Australia sorted for us. We're
Yeah.
no longer going to have states and territories.
Yeah.
We're going to have imperial zones that are managed by the imperial viceroy.
And we live in the soft underbelly, apparently.
Ooh, exciting, yeah.
No, I thought that was important when I read that. You can listen to Malcolm Turnbull, who's obviously very salty about the deal. He was the architect of the French submarine deal.
Yeah.
So you can say, he's just being salty. He's upset that his deal didn't get through. And then you can listen to us on the Left Hook podcast raving about it and go, these guys have no idea what they're talking about. This is just their political opinions.
Yeah.
But no, actually, listen to what the planners of war inside the Pentagon are saying and planning. This is objectively what's happening. And I think it's not being discussed in a democratic, open way here in Australia. People aren't talking about...
I've not heard anyone say that. Why is that not front page news?
No, it's not.
In every single newspaper.
Yeah.
Far out.
So Europe is becoming independent of the United States. They're remilitarizing. Australia, it seems, is being more and more subservient towards the United States. Obviously, the discussions of interoperability, interchangeability between the United States Army and the Australian Army, and the more the more purchasing of US weapons and components.
Yeah, right.
And the only party to come out and oppose this and say, hang on a sec, shouldn't we have our own capabilities and at least our own industry here to produce it, has been the Greens so far, which I find...
That's quite funny, actually.
It is quite funny, yeah, it is really.
It is quite funny. Wow. So, look, as a soft underbelly dweller, I've got, again, lots to look forward to in the next couple decades.
Yeah.
Where do you think that'll lead? Where do you think all this information... Where do you think that'll leads us to?
Look, I'm not going to... Last week I made some predictions. This week I'm going to make no predictions. We will wait and see. I think the pushback against AUKUS is now stronger than ever. It's going to continue. Whether that has any effect on policy is yet to be seen. Yeah. And let's be honest, the Greens are pretty insignificant. Yeah. They can come up with these policies which seem pretty reasonable. However, they're not going to actually win seats or have any influence on government, I don't think.
That's it. Well, we do have the upcoming election.
Yes,
so
correct.
we'll find out, obviously.
We will. And I think that Australia will choose to pursue an alliance with the US and become closer and closer. And whether that means we get these subs or not, who knows?
It just leaves a bad taste in your mouth.
It does.
Or for me personally.
All right, James, we'll wrap it up there.
Cheers, mate.
Thanks.